So now let's turn to the best long-term prospective study of outcomes of schizophrenia and psychotic patients that, to my knowledge, has ever been done. And it begins in the late 1970s and early 1980s. It's done by Martin Harrow. He's a psychologist at the University of Illinois, and here's how the study is designed. It's a naturalistic study. It's not randomized. He's just going to recruit 200 patients from 2 different hospitals into his study. One's going to be private, one public. That way he gets a class mix and an ethnic mix. And he's just going to follow them. Everybody's going to be treated with drugs. They're going to get discharged, and he's going to follow them at 2 years, 4.5, 7.5, 10, 15, and 20 years. Each follow-up, he's going to look, are they symptomatic? Are they working? Are they in school? He's going to measure their anxiety levels, their cognitive functioning. And really, it's the only study I know that's really going to be prospective and follow up people with regularity across 2 decades. Now, the amazing thing is first of all, you'll see this data is from his 15-year follow-up. Of 200 patients, he still has 145 in his study. And any of you who've done research on schizophrenia, if you can keep 77% of your patients in for 15 years, that is really good follow-up. And you'll see he ends up with 64 schizophrenia patients, 81 with milder disorders. The other good thing about this, it's a young cohort, half first episode, so we're getting them early on in the course of the disorder, okay? Now, here's his findings. Now, he groups his data in different ways. This data is actually of people who got off medication, schizophrenia patients, by year 2 and stayed off the rest of the time, versus medication-compliant patients. So this is actually a subset of the 64 schizophrenia patients, okay? But by the way, something like 25 of the 64 schizophrenia patients did get off antipsychotics, and most of them stayed off, okay? Wouldn't happen today, but in the early 80s there was more possibility. So what do you see here? This is data you don't see anywhere else in the literature. Remember we talked about the relapse literature? You go off, you do poorly? What this data is showing, see what happens between year 2 and 4.5? What are you seeing here? Seeing a lot of healing here. In other words, they're off and they're still psychotic 60% at 2 years, but it abates in so many of those who stay off. And then look at those who get stable. They stay stable. You see that? And now how about those who were medication compliant? You see a lot of active, they're remaining psychotic. So this actually is consistent with the dopamine supersensitivity worry. And when Martin Harrow published this, he says, we've got a problem. This actually does seem to confirm this previous worry we had in the 1980s that these drugs may be increasing vulnerability to psychosis over the long term. Here's your anxiety symptoms, percentage with severe anxiety. Anxiety is correlated with outcome. You have the same thing, a lot of healing between 2 and 4.5 years, right? Whereas those on antipsychotics, you actually see a lot of enduring anxiety. If you read Martin Harrow's paper, he's worried about something called tardive anxiety, basically. And what he's saying is maybe you're getting a permanent akathisia that develops where people have this inner agitation. Anyway, that's what he's worried about here. Again, if the brain shrinkage stuff is true and they worsen cognitive function, what do you see here? You see better cognitive function at every single follow-up point for the off-medication group. Recovery rates. What is recovery? Well, in this study, it was a very robust definition of recovery. It wasn't just symptom control. To be in recovery, you had to be asymptomatic. You couldn't have been in the hospital in the past year, and most important, there was a functional component. You had to be working or in school at least 50% of the time. All right? So what do you see here? At 2 years, it's roughly 20% for the off group versus about 7% are in recovery for the on medication group. See what happens again between year 2 and 4.5? This is the only place in the scientific literature you see this healing process that is going on over a lengthy process, okay? But anyway, it's about 40% to 5%, an 8-fold higher recovery rate. You see that throughout the course of the study. Now, he also, at the end of 15 years, he divides his outcomes into 3 groups: recovered, so-so, uniformly poor. What do you see? You'll see that the recovery rate for the off-medication group is 8 times higher. The other thing is about the same for the fair group, but look how many more in the uniformly poor group with the medication group. So it's as if outcomes have shifted along a spectrum to a more chronic outcome. Now, this is what he said at the 2008 meeting of the American Psychiatric Association. Now, this is the researcher who's done the best prospective long-term outcome study we have. And all of you who read this in your Danish newspaper, this finding, raise your hand. This is the problem. Because it went to... Oh, by the way, you know what the hypothesis of this study was? The point was to find out what happened to people who went off their medication. And the expectation was they were going to have terrible outcomes. They're going to be homeless. They're going to be just horrible. So the expectation was to find the opposite thing. And by the way, one of the things that's really interesting here, the group that got off medication, do you think they stayed in the psychiatric system? They left. What happens is they disappeared to the psychiatrist. The psychiatrist saw that people who went off their meds, did poorly, and came back. Those who got off and did well, they left the system. And the other thing is, do you think they told their employers that they were once schizophrenic? They disappeared. And there were people who, one became a teacher, one became a lawyer, there were a number of that became professionals. What he says, it's the clinician's illusion. We don't see these people who do well and leave the system. By the way, he had trouble getting this published, just so you know. No, he did. He was told that, when I interviewed him, he said he was told, do not publish, it's bad for psychiatry. This is just that 81 milder group. You'll see this. Once again, the milder group, psychotic disorders, it's really mania with psychosis, depression with psychosis. These are really good outcomes, by the way. The employment rate was well above 50%. Oh, and by the way, you know what the employment rate was? I don't have this data. He has something called sustained periods of employment. And to have a sustained period of employment, you had to be employed like at the 7.5-year follow-up and also at the 10-year follow-up. Okay? That's one period of sustained follow-up. Of the group that got off medication and stayed off medication, what percentage do you think had 2 or more sustained periods of employment? Any guesses? 87%. A lot were working. How about those who were medication compliant? What percentage even had 1 sustained period of employment? 17%. So a huge difference in terms of employment. Now this chart, I think, is in some ways, I actually put this chart together by his data. So what happens is he ends up with 4 groups, right? He ends up with schizophrenia on and off, milder on and off. So we have the best is milder off, then schizophrenia off, then milder on. You see the problem here? Why does schizophrenia, which is a worse prognosis, off end up better than milder on? Now, I only have one explanation, but I think at the very least we should know this and we should have a debate over it. I think this explanation is consistent with medications that are iatrogenic over the long term and worsen long-term outcomes. Because again, the milder disorders, they, by the very nature of the diagnosis, had a better prognosis. So now, when Martin Harrow published his 15-year data, he did not say this. If you read his 15-year data article, he says this. It's not the drug's fault. And if you read anatomy, you'll see this is what he initially said. He said, what happens is the drugs helped those with a good prognosis of schizophrenia stabilize and get well. And what my data shows is that there's just a subset of patients that that can do better off. Okay, so he said in his 15-year paper, he's explaining it's a difference in sort of severity of illness to explain his data. But I said to him, when he said that, I said, but what about this? And that's when he said to me, you are so naive. He said, you know, I was told not to publish this. It's bad for psychiatry. I'm worried about my funding, blah, blah, blah. Now, he's done his 20-year stuff. He's getting funding no longer from the NIMH, but actually a foundation that formed in response to anatomy. And now he's saying this. Now he's saying, maybe we have to go back to this idea of oppositional tolerance. You can see it. He's saying this, okay, they're effective over the short term, but it wouldn't be so odd to see a drug that had a benefit over the short term turn harmful in the long term. So all of a sudden, the lead researcher of the best long-term study is raising this question that, frankly, when anatomy came out 4 years ago, was seen as complete heresy. And by the way, one of the criticisms of anatomy was that I was misinterpreting Harrow. It was, even though I gave Harrow's explanation in it, I didn't use the words, it was just the good prognosis patients who got better, because here's what happened. His good prognosis schizophrenia patients did better than his good prognosis on. His bad prognosis off did better than bad prognosis on, and you saw that other chart. So I knew that explanation wasn't reflected in the data. Now in his 20-year data, he's actually citing me saying, he's been bringing this up. So it's like a little bit of rehabilitation against that criticism. But you can see now this is entering mainstream American psychiatry. Next, one of the criticisms of Harrow was that it was naturalistic. It's not randomized. We only listen to randomized data. We now have a new randomized study out of the Netherlands done by Lex Wunderich. Here's how this one was designed. People got stabilized on drug. Now they're randomized in which they're either discontinued or tapered down to a real low dose or maintained on the drug. So it's randomized. Two things. By the way, the drug was withdrawn pretty fast. You'll see at the end of 2 years there was a higher relapse rate in the drug withdrawn or drug tapered group, but they managed those relapses often. They were minor. Functional outcomes were about the same at 2 years, and then at 7 years you'll see actually a little bit higher relapse rate in the group randomized to regular care. How about recovery rates? Again, a functional component. You'll see a higher recovery rate in the group randomized to low dose or tapered all the way. Now, his study after randomization does become naturalistic because at some point those randomized to the drug withdrawn group can go on back to regular medication. Those randomized to normal care might take themselves off. So here's just a grouping by drug usage. You'll see again it's those either discontinued or down to a very low dose that have higher symptom remission, higher functional remission, full recovery. So what does Lex Wunderich say? To conclusion, this is a randomized study. They may worsen functional outcomes. Okay, and this just came out, I think it's 2013. May impair alertness, curiosity, drive, executive functional capacity. So again, you're seeing another study long-term raising the same questions. And this, I think, is brilliant. He's saying we've been looking at the wrong things. We've been looking at those relapse studies, but it's too short a time period. We need to extend our perspective, and we also need to look at long-term functional outcomes.